Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, or possibly good evening. My name is Elisabeth Braw. I'm a visiting fellow at AEI working on something called Grayzone defense. And I have discovered over the years that Grayzone defense sounds a bit gray, or rather, it's a bit unknown to many people. And that shouldn't be so, because it's incredibly relevant today, and not just gray zone defense, but more specifically gray zone aggression, because lots of countries are experiencing it, whether they notice it or not. And that's why we are hosting this event today to provide an introduction into gray zone defense, gray zone aggression and defense, what gray zone aggression is, who is being affected by it, and what we can do about it. And it's, even though the subject or the term may not be very well known, I can give a secret away, which is that everybody is being affected by gray zone aggression. So just to give you an example, 3 years ago, Ukraine was hit by a phenomenally powerful computer virus that took down airports, hospitals, virtually every single government agency, banks, retail companies, and so forth. And that virus then traveled on from Ukraine to hit lots of other companies worldwide. For example, it hit Maersk, which is the world's largest shipping container company. We rely on it for virtually everything we consume. It's just we don't know about it, because who of us has ever been to a port to receive whatever it is we need? We all depend on Maersk. It hit Merck, which is, as we all know, an American pharmaceutical giant. It hit Mondelez, which is an American snack giant. And it hit FedEx European subsidiary, and so forth. Lots of companies were hit, even though they themselves are not hated by any specific country. But this is where we are today, where gray zone aggression, which is forms of aggression that take place below the threshold of armed conflict, are happening with great regularity, one can almost say every single day, and where they affect companies, especially in our countries here in the West, and ordinary citizens as well. So and we shouldn't forget that gray zone aggression, of course, includes disinformation, which is something that I know Americans have been greatly concerned about, at the very least since the 2016 election. So it seemed, not just it seemed, it is a very good idea to discuss what constitutes gray zone aggression, what's happening in different areas, in industry, in politics, in infrastructure. And to do that, I have been joined by 3 fantastic experts from different walks of life. So I'll introduce them alphabetically. We'll start with Hélène Galy, who is she leads something called the Willis Research Network, which is the research arm of Willis Towers Watson, which is one of the world's largest insurance brokers. And why insurance brokerage on an AEI call, you might ask, about national security? Well, the insurance industry is on the absolute forefront in watching and trying to figure out what to do about this aggression, because when something goes wrong, insurance companies pay. Then we have Pål Jonson, who is the chairman of the Swedish Parliament's Defense Committee, and in that capacity, he's in charge of trying to determine where defense money should be invested. Obviously, the government has an opinion too, as is the case in most democracies, but Parliament has a very, very important role in determining what the right strategy is and whether the government's plans make sense. And I should also add that in Sweden, defense investments are very much, or defense spending very much happens on the basis of consensus between all parties represented in Parliament. So that's why Pål sits in a very important post. Then Mark Montgomery, who is the executive director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which is commission, bipartisan, or rather I should say non-partisan commission appointed by Congress, comprising congressional members of Congress, Senate and the House, federal leaders, and then the secretariat is led by Mark, who's a former US Navy officer. rising to the rank of Rear Admiral. And if anybody on this call hasn't read the Cyberspace Solarium Commission's recommendations, they are fantastic and really show what can be done in the bipartisan or even non-partisan fashion to make the country safer, because as we all know, cyber attacks are part of Grayzone aggression, and they affect the US and other countries every single day. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Paul, followed by Mark, and then Hélène. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth, and great to be with you from Stockholm and say a few words about Grayzone aggression and how we dealt with it in Sweden. It feels very appropriate as I look out the window. As you know, Elisabeth, Sweden in November is permanently gray, so we are definitely in a gray zone. But to be serious, I think our approach to Grayzone, it's bound to be shaped also by our geographic proximity to Russia. We are currently exposed to a multi-dimensional threat situation, which includes a combination of military and non-kinetic threat risks and vulnerabilities at the same time. Thus, I guess my first point would be that we don't really have the luxury to choose where we allocate resources between mitigating risk associated with Grayzone or building up the armed forces. We just simply need to do two things at the same time. Unfortunately, as you also know, the risk of armed conflict in Europe has increased during the last decade. We also know that elements of what we associate with Grayzone would be connected also to an armed conflict in the run-up or in the early stages of a conflict. I'm thinking, for example, about cyber attacks and disinformation operations. So when you're working on securing the states, you need to keep two ideas in your head at the same time. I guess that would be my introduction when it comes to the allocation of resources. Of course, much of our thinking has been shaped about about gray zones, about the illegal annexation of Crimea, small green men popping up on Crimea, and Russia's aggression against Ukraine. However, I would say that the world has grown considerably more complex in 2014 in at least three ways. It has become much more digital, it has become much more Hobbesian, and considerably much more Chinese. Let me explain the last point there. But I think that the basic line is here that you see these gray zone methods being used, and I think they are pretty much symptoms of the fact that we're back to a stage of great power rivalry again between the great powers, as also outlined in the US national security strategies. From a Swedish perspective, I think that main perpetrators are well known. It's about China and it's about Russia. Let me also be very clear that this is not a threat. This is a challenge that we're dealing with 24/7 on a daily basis. I think it's also fair to say that it's growing exponentially, especially due to the very rapid digitalization process that we're undergoing. Also, when we build on our intellectual heritage on approaching gray zone aggression, I think we draw some lessons also to our total defense concept. As you know, we used to have a military and a civilian defense. Civil defense is very much about the whole of government endeavors. I think that's also very much the case when you approach gray zone challenges, that you need a whole of government approach. I think it's also fair to say that the more prepared you are to handle an armed attack against your society, the better you're actually equipped also to handle these kind of gray zone events. And I think the third point I would make on gray zone and total defense is actually to look at Finland. Finland is considered a little bit like the shining city on top of the hill these days when it comes to handling gray zones and hybrid threats. I think they're advancing their ideas very vividly within the EU and NATO, and they're of course home of the EU-NATO Center of Excellence against hybrid threats. I think we have much to learn from Finland because they also have a total defense concept and also focusing quite a lot on resilience. Now, briefly, going back also to your excellent paper, Elisabeth, I will try to be a little bit more concrete on how we handled some of the challenges connected to gray zones in Sweden, particularly subversive business practices, disinformation campaigns, and cyber attacks. And in all these three cases, I think that we have had a very similar approach. We've been working on reviewing old legislation or adopting new legislations. We've been establishing new government agencies. We're working more on our interagency process, and we're working more in cooperation with other countries and other organizations. First, on subversive business practices, it's well known that Sweden is a large recipient of foreign direct investment, particularly from China. I think the challenge is when those investments are directed into our critical infrastructure. We used to have a potent legislation up to 1993, then we abolished that, and for a while went a little bit what I call happy-go-lucky. We realized during this pandemic, where we have seen an increase in these hybrid aggressions, that was unsustainable. So we quickly amended our legislation to provide a better security, so we can actually make calls against illicit foreign direct investment into critical infrastructure. We also mandated our export control agency to be in charge of reviewing foreign direct investment into critical infrastructure, and that's also appointed point of contact vis-a-vis the EU in this case. I think actually what you should keep in mind also is that the European Commission has done a lot of good work on this. A year and a half ago, there was about half of the EU member states who actually didn't have any legislation at all in place in order to meet this challenge, and the EU Commission is actually pushing us to get better legislation, which is of course increasingly important due to the economic ramifications of the COVID-19 and what will follow from that. Secondly, speaking a little bit about the mounting challenge of disinformation campaigns, I think it's rather systematic. It comes both from Russia and China. We are actually revamping an all-government agency for psychological defense, who's going to be tasked with handling this challenge of these systematic disinformation operations that we are exposed to. It's about identifying, analyzing, and also being able to respond to such operations. This agency will work in close cooperation with our intelligence and security service. I think it's vital also to have the capability both to identify and to attribute where these kind of operations are originating from. In addition, we're also working closely both with EU and NATO. We have people stationed at the Stratcom East at the EU External Action Service, and we also have people at Stratcom NATO Center of Excellence in Riga, which we learn quite a lot from. Finally, on cyber, I think it's well known also for us that the advanced persistent threats are increasing in strength and magnitude exponentially. The paradox for Sweden is that we score very well on digitalization. We tend to be early adopters of technologies. At the same time, we don't score so well on cybersecurity, which means that you have a lot of vectors that you can actually attack. And we are rapidly catching up on cybersecurity. One way about going is that we looked from the British side, where they have the Cyber Operations Center. We're trying to adopt the same kind of structure into Sweden, where 8 different agencies are going to be pooling and sharing their resources. I think that the Brits got it right when they also talked about the Safe Marketplace UK, which means that you need to work very closely in cooperation with the private sector when you deal with cybersecurity. In addition, I think that the EU's Network and Security Directive, the NIS directive, has also done good things to push member states to, for example, adopt cybersecurity strategies, mandatory incidenting reporting, and higher network security. So for a small country like us, it's important to work in cooperations with others. Finally, 3 short notes on how to go about and rise to the occasion when you are exposed to Grayzone aggression. I talked about legislations, institutions, and international cooperation. You need a whole of government approach to this when you enhance your resilience in your society. Secondly, it's pivotal to have situational awareness. I think in order to identify, prepare, and respond to Grayzone aggression. And finally, which I think we're going to be talking a little bit more about further on, but it's this private-public partnership, which is really crucial, because so much of your critical infrastructure these days is in the hands of private companies. So you need to have this flow of information between those actors. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And you brought up an aspect that I hope we'll discuss much more in the Q&A section of this conversation. And on that note, please feel free to start sending your questions as soon as you think of them. And I should also mention that this is again, an aspect of gray zone aggression that doesn't seem like a big deal, but in accumulation is a big deal. Strategic acquisitions by companies based in foreign countries, and obviously that's acquisitions, international acquisitions are the lifeblood of the globalized economy. But when one particular country or particular countries exploit the openness of other countries, that's where we have a problem, and that's what's happening now, which is why a number of parliaments, including the Swedish one, are looking at better regulation along the lines of CFIUS, which is obviously the US regulator. And Paul, maybe very quickly, if you can mention, if you can tell the listeners what happened to 3 cutting-edge Swedish space technology companies. Was it last year?
Yeah, it was. Of course, we have a strict export control for very good reasons, and this is also something we cooperate with the EU. They have something called the EU military list, and without getting into much details, this was technology that they weren't allowed to export to China. And what happened was that a Chinese company actually bought them. It was based in Sweden. I think that really made us aware of the unintended consequences sometimes of this foreign acquisition as well. And now we're rapidly moving to get good legislation so things like that will not emerge again. But it shows some of the vulnerabilities that we weren't really prepared for.
Exactly. So to summarize, the companies couldn't export their technology to China, but there were no regulations in place to prevent the Chinese company from buying them, which is what happened. And we have to remember this is dual use technology, so very much a national security issue. I will pass the floor, as it were, the digital floor, to Mark now.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Real pleasure to be here. Look, as we talk about the Grayzone, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission that I'm the executive director of, we really grew out of Senate and House concerns about the Grayzone. Senator Nassas, Senator McCain, Congressman Langevin all had concerns that they could see deterrence wasn't working throughout all of cyberspace. The traditional U.S. National security response wasn't working throughout all of cyberspace. Now, look, it was working at the high end. Nation states weren't executing large-scale cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure, turning off the power supply. The idea that we had both cyber and non-cyber tools to respond probably, was still working. But really, countries had found that they could threaten U.S. interests without triggering escalation in the gray zone. And, there's a lot of examples. There's the Chinese theft of, 24 million government personnel records from OPM, really over a 15-year period, the theft of more than $1 trillion worth of intellectual property, unrealized GDP growth through intellectual property theft. We saw it with Russia with cyber-enabled information operations campaigns against our elections in 2016 and against some of our European partners and allies' elections in the 2016-2017 timeframe. We saw it with DPR, North Korean attack on Sony, or even going back a little further, Iranian attacks on our banks in the 2012-2013 timeframe. So a lot of examples out there where people were operating below the level of a U.S. response in the cyber gray zone. So we sat back in one of our tasks that we got from Senator McCain was come up with a strategic approach to prevent this kind of significant cyber activity. And we came up with kind of 3 additions that you had to put into in addition to a traditional deterrence of imposed cost, deny benefit, and try to reach a shared agreement. And that was the 3 ideas were that first we had to improve our defense. It's for the United States is an uncomfortable thing. The Europeans have had this problem for 50 or 60 years, but our adversaries weren't close. We had 4,000 miles of the Atlantic, 6,000 miles Pacific, good neighbors in Canada and Mexico. We didn't have to worry. Geography gave us a lot of protection. Well, cyber removed that geography. So we actually needed, our critical infrastructure is now at risk. And the way I kind of looked at it was, the availability of tools is increasing exponentially. The networking of our systems is increasing exponentially, and our investment in cybersecurity was kind of linear and at best with a slight upslope. So these 2 risk drivers we're increasing exponentially. Your risk mitigator is at best, slightly linear. You're introducing a lot of risk in the system. So that geographic issue, the introduction of risk, we really needed to improve our defense of our critical infrastructure, something the United States hadn't really undertaken in 60 or 70 years. That led to the second kind of big issue we determined, which is that 85% of that infrastructure is owned by the private sector, operated by the private sector, not .gov or .mil, so to speak. So we really needed to build an effective public-private collaboration. Now, look, you can go all the way back to 1998. I worked at the White House when we produced Presidential Decision Directive 63. We said exactly that, but we really didn't mean it. And in the 5 sequential reports by the federal government that we needed to build public-private collaboration, we didn't really mean it. We didn't put our level of effort into achieving it. A lot of it had to do with the idea that the real problems then were just criminals, and that's a private sector problem. And we tended to not really address this, but I think there's a recognition now that we have to address this public-private collaboration. And then finally, we realized that we needed to be able to operate, our systems in the gray zone more effectively. We needed to improve the offense. I'll pick up on that and say the same NDA that authorized the commission also authorized cyber surveillance and reconnaissance as a traditional military activity. That really gave the authorities that Cybercom would need. When you combine that with the Department of Defense's defense cyber strategy for 2018, which emphasized the ideas of defend forward and persistent engagement. Ironically, the same week the White House released a national cyber strategy, didn't even mention this, but the Department of Defense very aggressively mentioned it. But the White House did come through with something called National Security Presidential Memorandum 13 that has become the organizing methodology for conducting offensive cyber operations in the gray zone. So you had authorities from the Congress, a strategy from the Department of Defense, and then the process set up inside the White House. We actually did really significantly improve in 2018, early 2019, our offensive capabilities. So we could match our offensive capacity, because we were able to match our capabilities, the 130 plus teams at Cybercom, with a credible intent to use them. So to me, that begins to introduce deterrence back into this, if used properly, to confront the adversary behavior at its source. This kind of what's called persistent engagement practiced by U.S. Cyber Command made a difference. But one of the things the commission says, you got to step back for a second and not just use these military tools. So it advocated persistent engagement, advocated defend forward, but said defend forward is more than just these military tools. It's also economic tools, sanctions against individuals and companies and countries that operate, conduct malicious activity in cyber in the gray zone. It's about law enforcement, increasing the funding to our NCIJTF and FBI task force that looks at these cyber issues, increasing our number of indictments of malicious actors overseas, increasing our number of cyber attaches overseas from 6, I think, to eventually 20 is what we're trying to get to. So we have more of our professional presence overseas in embassies. And then finally, diplomatic, we're recommending an Assistant Secretary of State, but also a more aggressive engagement by the United States, both in international forum, but also with our coalition of the willing, those partners who are willing to work with us to identify and attribute more rapidly the malicious activity and who did it. I mean, it's still a problem when I think on this the most recent Russian intervention and cyber incident in Georgia, done by the Russian government, the US and UK were excited that they attributed it within 90 days. That's not really timely. We still need to really work on that attribution. So we had to work that offensive side. The other 2 big aspects from the commission were these defensive things. We need to be better organized. We recommend a national cyber director provide that strategic leadership at the White House to integrate the interagency and then build that public-private collaboration alongside a strengthened CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security, which is run by Chris Krebs now. Together, we think those 2 can help build the executive branch side of the public-private collaboration. We're also recommending that inside the White House, we do better planning ahead of time for events and have a better initial response. Now, watching the pandemic, we actually wrote a white paper that said, look, what the pandemic teaches you, the pandemic is a non-traditional national security emergency. a cyber attack is a non-traditional, a cyber attack on your homeland is a non-traditional national security emergency. If we've learned anything from COVID-19, is that pre-planning, building relationships ahead of time, having an effective initial response, and then having your recovery, your long-term recovery, those are critical. And so having that kind of leadership in the White House would have been effective in COVID-19 and will be effective going forward in cyber if we have that national cyber director. And then finally, we made quite a few recommendations on how to build the infrastructure for public-private collaboration. And I think a lot of these are going to be in the next National Defense Authorization Act, the one that will be approved in the next couple of weeks. So the infrastructure will be in place for the Biden administration to begin to build that public-private collaboration. But it's going to take investment, because we've had this epiphany 4 or 5 times in the last 20 years, but we haven't had the strength of character to complete it. We're going to need to do that. And it means having a federal information sharing center, the federal agencies share with, and then share with the private sector what types of threat vectors we're seeing. It's about having a joint collaborative environment of that data being pushed back and forth, not by email, but actually by, in real time. It's having a joint cyber planning office where we work with the private sector about how to build a more resilient, redundant, and recoverable infrastructure when there's the inevitable successful attack. And then finally, it's about creating a better cyber ecosystem. And this is where the insurance companies come in. We think we need to have a Bureau of Cyber Statistics so that we can have a more effective amount of information and data for underwriters and others to provide a better product to the private sector and in the insurance companies. And we think that will help, kind of raise the tide of cybersecurity kind of writ large across the government, while the infrastructure for public collaboration really targets the high-end infrastructure that the government relies on in its executing its day-to-day mission. So Cyberspace Solarium Commission kind of looked at all those issues, but it all emanates from a challenge in the gray zone and the inability of our traditional national security apparatus to deal with it. And so I think if we implement these in the next National Defense Authorization Act, we'll be in a lot better position.
You will be, and other countries can learn from the Commission's recommendations as well. And we should mention that the reason that there is so much activity in the gray zone now today is that our countries, NATO and its allies, are pretty well set up militarily. They may not be perfect, but they're very good. And so there would be high cost, enormous cost to anybody attacking a NATO member states or one of their partners. But in the gray zone, it's unclear exactly how an attacker would be punished. And at the moment, they are not punished at all, apart from a little bit of US and British and other allied offensive cyber capability, and that's where our challenge is. But at the moment, the gray zone is extremely attractive, and the reason the reason we know that it's attractive is that it's continuing to grow. And I should also say that the case that I mentioned previously, not Petya, that ended up bringing down so many really vital companies in the West. It's really interesting to see how that case then turned out, because it illustrates where we are today. One of the companies ended up where they wanted to claim on their insurance, and virtually all insurance has a war clause that says in case of war, these conditions, well, your policy doesn't apply, because obviously in a war all bets are off. And this company claimed on their policy, and their insurer said, well, this act was attributed to a foreign country. It's a hostile country, in this case Russia. It's an act of war, so your policy is not valid. And so here we have this case about what constitutes war being fought out, as it were, by 2 private companies at a court in Illinois, and that really illustrates where we are today. Hélène, on that note, over to you.
Thank you, Elisabeth, and thank you very much for inviting me to join this panel, and to Pål and Mark for dropping a few hints, which I'll pick up on, because grey zone aggression is very relevant for the insurance sector and for the private sector as a whole, and it can have very serious consequences, financial, increased uncertainty, and reputational damage. So in the next few minutes, I want to look at a few examples of disruption. I want to consider how insurance can help organizational but also societal resilience, but also consider the limits of insurance and in this situation, and how we need dialogues like today to reimagine insurance in a grey zone world. Now, let me start with 3 examples to convey the range and scale of impact on the private sector. And you've mentioned that example already, Elisabeth. NotPetya showed that no industry sector is safe from cyber attack. Any organization can end up as collateral damage. Beyond the intended Ukrainian targets, a number of multinationals were affected: Maersk, Merck, Mondelez, and that's only looking at companies starting with M. Other letters of the alphabet were affected too. Now, another example is an emerging trend in the maritime space. Satellite communication interference, GPS jamming, especially in waters close to conflict zones. And in 2017, for example, the captains of several vessels operating in the Black Sea reported that their GPS was placing them at an airport 25 miles inland of Russia. So it's not ideal if the ship's officer can't know the vessel's position and speed. And going into waters subjected to sanctions can also invalidate your insurance policy, although that might be the least of your concerns if you make it safely back to port. Now, a final example, if it's not bad enough to see your data and your IT systems compromised, cyber attacks can also create physical damage. Stuxnet is probably the best known industrial control system malware, but even before, in 2008, a pipeline in Turkey exploded after cyber criminals hacked into its control systems. And not only is malware proliferating, but we're also increasingly vulnerable to these attacks. I mean, look at us spending our lives on Zoom and relying on the Internet of Things for all aspects of our lives. So in that context, how can insurance, in particular cyber insurance, help? A cyber risk is not simply a technology risk. It often comes down to people risk. And people really represent the largest source of data breach claims. We've looked at data, cyber claims data, and it shows that employee negligence or malicious acts account for 2/3 of cyber claims, of cyber breaches. And so this vulnerability can be fatal if you get caught into the grey zone. And an interesting example, in July 2019, the US Coast Guard issued a safety alert following a cyber incident which had completely debilitated the computer systems of a large container ship heading for New York. And their investigation with the FBI concluded that, 1, the ship's computer systems did not contain any antivirus software. 2, the crew had common login details. And 3, portable data storage devices were routinely plugged into the ship's computer systems without any screening. So very poor cyber hygiene. So insurance solutions can play a key role in mitigating the impact of cyber threats, because healthy insurance markets typically incentivize the right behaviors. So to get insurance and to get better premiums, organizations are encouraged to improve their risk management and to reduce their vulnerabilities. And as an insurance broker, we don't just arrange cyber insurance. We do a lot of work upstream to help our clients adopt a better cyber hygiene, to reduce their cyber risk and, in the end, the risk for society as a whole. So that sounds great, but this approach has a few limits. The cyber market, to start with, is very small. At $2.5 billion of premium, this is 0.03% of the global insurance market. So this is tiny. And why is that? Well, I think, Mark, you alluded to that. Insurers don't like insuring what they don't understand, what they can't quantify. And so more data, more understanding of cyber occurrences, cyber claims, and modeling can, in particular, help determine what kind of insurance, what kind of cyber risk can be insured now and in future. Now, insurance is also based on the principle of mutualization. So it works well when the premiums of the many pay for losses incurred by a few. But for systemic risks like cyber, like pandemic, when the whole system can be impacted, this logic falls over and insurance may not be viable. Another limitation of insurance is the small print, the fine print, exclusions. Many traditional policies exclude losses if caused by a cyber attack. And in some cases, the policy may be silent on whether losses arising from cyber risk is covered or excluded. And that potentially gives rise to uncertainty and lawsuits. And we call that silent cyber. And it is as worrying as it sounds to insurers. And finally, Elisabeth, you've alluded to that, insurers have their own grey zone. And there's a serious ambiguity in how insurance policies treat state-sponsored cyber incidents. Some property and casualty insurers declined to pay the NotPetya-related claims, invoking their war exclusions. And the ongoing lawsuit between Mondelez and their insurer will be very interesting to follow. A great deal hangs on the outcome of this case. So does that mean it's time for insurance to be reimagined in this grey world, this grey zone world? We rely increasingly on technology. And so it's not a surprise that there is an increase in cyber incidents across sectors. And the current really small cyber insurance market is inadequate. And we're working hard to widen that market. But there are clear lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic, as Mark alluded to. Exclusions are unpopular, they're misunderstood, and they create uncertainty for consumers, and they damage insurers' reputation. The pandemic has also shown that insurers don't have infinitely deep pockets, and they cannot pay for all the damages. And so government backstops may be necessary to support the private insurance market. So for now, the uncertainty attached to the grey zone continues to inhibit the development of cyber insurance markets. And this is not something that the insurance sector on its own can solve. And it really requires discussions across the public and private sector. And this is why I want to thank you again, Elisabeth, for continuing to promote this kind of debate on these challenges and for offering a safe place for new ideas to be aired. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hélène. Well, that is the point of a think tank, to bring together the best thinkers and practitioners so that they can explore, well, present and build new ideas based on what they hear from their peers, and not just from their peers within the same sector, but across society. And it's especially important when it comes to Grayzone, which can obviously strike any part of society. And we should add that there is really no limit to which tricks our adversaries can try against us, because the only limit is their imagination. And I'll just mention two seemingly ridiculous examples. You remember a couple of pranksters, Russian pranksters, called Senator Graham a couple of years ago and asked him something about the Kurds, and got him to say things that he thought he was speaking to a Turkish official, but in fact these were Russian pranksters who sort of pranked on behalf of the Russian government. They have a habit of calling all kinds of NATO officials and get them to say things that in hindsight they probably wish they hadn't said. And then we have things like the acquisition a couple of years ago of Grindr, which is a dating website for gay people. And then when it was acquired by a Chinese company, the US regulator CFIUS thought nothing of it, and it wasn't even on CFIUS's radar, because CFIUS deals with national security, not dating apps. And then he realized that there may be a national security problem if the Chinese government, through this Chinese owner, gets access to to the data on Grindr, and so CFIUS, in a very unusual turn of events, forced a sale of, or a divestment of Grindr. So we have lots of questions coming in. I'll start with one for you, Pål. And I should also mention that Pål is on the latest episode of on the CASP podcast, talking about Sweden's new defense budget, which is a phenomenal increase, 40% over the next 4 years, including a doubling of civil defense spending. So very big step there proposed by the government. So the question for you, Pål, from Manuel Torres, author of author of a book as well, but here's his question. Would you agree that the success of the Swedish total defense concept can be morphed into a pan-Atlantic NATO-EU approach to countering hybrid threats? Or is total defense the result of a very particular Swedish culture that would be difficult to apply to other countries? And total defense, we should remember, is the defense developed by Sweden during World War II and then perfected during the Cold War, of involving all parts of society in keeping the country safe. The armed forces doing their part, but the rest of the country doing civilian tasks. So over to you, Pål.
Well, thank you for that question. I think that the whole concept of civil defense might be hard to both export and to re-establish in Sweden. I think there's two things that are very different from when we did this with a very serious intent up to the 1980s, and that is, first, now things are much more digital, so that the digital arena is something that changed the nature of civil defense quite a lot. The other thing is, of course, now most of the aspects connected to critical infrastructure is actually in the hands of private, not public, private actors. So I think the reestablishing of the private-public partnership is really, really crucial for civil defense these days. I think that NATO has done some good work on civil defense and predominantly on resilience. They work on something called 7 baseline requirements, where all allies are about expected to work on issues related to critical infrastructure, transport, energy, things like that, which I think lessons learned from that could also travel well into other countries. So there's certainly elements of it. I know Dan Hamilton, for example, has also talked about forward resilience, that you work with allies and partners also in the vicinity in the EU, also strengthening their resilience. So some elements of it I think can be exported. I don't foresee being as comprehensive as it was back in the days of the Cold War, because now we have a completely different world, but certainly some elements of it as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Pål. And here's a question for Mark from Travis Cotton at the Institute for Defense Analysis. You mentioned persistent engagement and defending forward. What do you believe should be the cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency's role in working with the US Cybercom and defending forward, since it has defending the homeland mission?
That's a great point. One of the things that's unique is that we've done a great job, because it's funded through DoD, and DoD has a pretty consistent large funding stream. The U.S. Cyber Command Cyber Mission Force has about 6,000 on-net operators. And then they're organized in 133 mission teams or so. There is an equivalence to that in the Homeland Security Department called the HURT teams, Homeland Security Incident Response Teams. But their numbers are, probably 1% to 2% the size of Cyber Mission Force in terms of on-net operators. So clearly, we need to invest more in there. I do think the HURT teams and CISA teams need to be operating generally in blue infrastructure, in other words, in U.S. infrastructure, and not going overseas, because I think you start to cross over authorities called Title 10 and Title 50. Now, that doesn't prevent military forces being seconded over to domestic agencies and operating under different titles than Title 10, which is military, and Title 50, which is intelligence, but operating under Homeland Security and titles, as they do support, say, the response to a to a natural disaster, like you see the National Guard and sometimes active duty military supporting when we have a hurricane or a earthquake kind of thing. So there are ways to flow one way, which is the military forces coming into a domestic situation, but there is not a way, in my mind, there's not near enough capacity or capability to flow the other. But I do think that we need to build out these HERT teams, and our recommendation, I believe we made an appropriations recommendation to increase their budget to about 40 million. It had been at about 8 or 9 million a year for these HERT teams. And it recently been increased to about 24 million. And we're asking to go all the way up to about 40 million. And then over time, increase it further, because you're going to need more and more of these teams where the private sector, where the government's helping the private sector. One thing I'd mentioned, I think it was Paul mentioned the advanced persistent threat teams. If an APT team from China or Russia targets a U.S. company or a non-U.S. company in the United States, it is not realistic for that company to defend itself alone, over a sustained, persistent campaign from a nation state. And so the government is going to have a capability and capacity to support that defense, and whether that's domestically, at the point of attack, or at the point of the attack being felt, or whether it's forward, trying to damage or mitigate the attack infrastructure being used by the Russian government or contractor.
Thank you, Mark. Hélène, a question for you. Well, it's for me as well, but I think you are better positioned to answer it as an industry representative. So here's the question. Given the current high complexity and multiple dimensions of the NATO exercises framework encountering hybrid threats, do you agree that involving industry, C-level executives and EU officials is something compulsory or optional to the success of modern warfare training? And so I believe this question was asked by Manuel Torres as well. And so Manuel, I've actually just published a paper where I proposed something related, which is joint military industry Grayzone exercises, which would obviously be defensive in nature because they would involve industry, but they would practice Grayzone scenarios, which at the moment nobody practices. So companies have every company, in fact, conducts crisis management exercises, but that's tactical scenarios. So what would happen if a factory burnt down, or if our engineers in a particular country were taken hostage by militants and so forth? But the industry leaders are realizing that Grayzone threats and forms of aggression affect their companies too, but they can't hold Grayzone exercises in isolation, because it's obviously not just about their companies. And so my proposal is for joint industry and military Grayzone exercises, and that idea is actually at the moment being implemented by a NATO member state. So I'd be many of us will be following them their work closely to see how they implement it, and so others can learn from it. But Hélène, over to you. Do you think it would be a good idea for NATO to invite industry leaders to participate in existing NATO exercises?
Yeah, definitely. And we've been following your the things you've published and argued about on this topic with much interest. Definitely, I think that closer collaboration with the private sector will be very welcome, both for preparedness, but also to help the insurance sector develop more products. So preparedness, it's quite obvious that better prepared companies who are managing all this infrastructure that is at stake, or who are going to be at the front line of response, it will pay off if they have more information to be more resilient when something happens. But it's also important to have a more ongoing dialogue, so that we improve the understanding of what this threat is, understand a bit more the frequency, the modes of attack, so that then we can build better databases and better models to try to grasp what this threat is, and then to see how we can maybe build more more insurance solutions around those threats.
Thank you, Hélène. Lots of excellent questions here. Here's one that I'd like to pose to Paul first, and then Mark, from Jeff Brancato, Northeast Ohio Cyber Consortium. Since so much of the vulnerability surface open to cyber attacks is critical infrastructure owned by the private sector, banks, investor-owned utilities, shipping and transport systems, what recommendations does the panel have for better engaging and integrating industry-led collaborative efforts? So, and that's not just a US phenomenon, it's in every liberal democracy today. Most companies most critical national infrastructure companies in the wider sense, including retail, are privately owned, and the government has very little power to tell them what to do. Yet, if their operations are disrupted, it is a very serious issue. So maybe over to you, Paul, first, and then.
Yeah, just very briefly. Well, there's a symbiotic relationship here within the private and the public sector. Of course, development of the technology that are in the hands of the public sector direly need is being developed within the private sector, and the know-how about some of the threats and risks and the knowledge, I think, is in the private sector. So you need a flow of information from the private sector to the public sector. At the same time, of course, you also need your security service and intelligence community need to have the ability also to share information. And here I think you have to grade the different companies due to what they're actually doing, you know, if they're working on particularly sensitive things, or if there's just a general service provider or something like that. So you need to grade it. The British model, they have something called the traffic light protocol, where they have specific designated companies that they can share information with that can be very sensitive, and those companies also have the necessary infrastructure within their companies how to handle classified information. So I think the grading of information and how you share information in the flow between the private and public sector is really crucial on this matter.
Mark, very quickly from you, because I have another question for you as well.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say I agree with everything Paul said. And I think what we really have to do is make sure that the intelligence community's collection prioritization is being influenced by the private sector. Historically, it didn't, like I said before cyber, protecting the national critical infrastructure was not something we had to do day to day. So we didn't prioritize our intelligence collection to look for malicious activity being aimed at our private sector. Now that we recognize that is the case, we actually have to allow the private sector to influence the national intelligence prioritization collection framework. And that's going to be hard. The intelligence committee is not excited about that opportunity. And we're going to have to probably push it through legislation to get it done.
Interesting. Here is a question for all three panelists. And so with 8 minutes left, if you can have a sort of a 1 minute go at it, all of you, because it really applies to everybody on this panel. Could you explain and discuss evident opposition by some tech companies to legislation requiring closer cooperation between government and the tech industry? And that question is from Roger Cochetti at RJC Associates. So maybe starting with you, Hélène. Do you have a take on why tech companies are so reluctant to work more closely with the government on Grayzone issues and maybe cyber security in particular?
Yeah, I guess they're a bit caught in between doing the right thing and then perpetuating systems and an openness and behaviors that are critical to their business models. So I guess we need some role models, someone who take the leap to say there are some red lines, there are some some key principles that need to be factored in our their own systems, and I guess that would put some peer pressure for others to follow. But I think it needs a champion. I don't have necessarily the tricks to convince them, but we just need one.
And the trick, if you introduce legislation, is that once legislation is in place and it becomes a compliance issue, then companies would do the minimum required to comply with the law. So that wouldn't be the perfect solution either. Quick answer from you, Paul.
Well, I would assume that goes back to the debate you had a few years ago about PRISM and the sharing of data and so forth, and how the platform economy would engage into the intelligence community, and that was sensitive. I think that you really got right, and what you're working on right now is this Defense Innovation Initiative, where you open these offices in Silicon Valley and Boston and huge, and try also to spin in technologies, and that means that you really need to try to get on board this big platforms economy to also work for the purpose of national security, but then you have to handle the data with the integrity and for the right cause. I'll stop there.
Is it the same? Does Sweden have the same dilemma that tech companies are reluctant to work with the government? I mean, obviously, bearing in mind that no country has the tech sector like the American.
Yeah, well, we have big platform economies like, or we're the home of Spotify and Klarna and Skype and so forth, and we have Ericsson. At the same time, we work closely with them on some issues, but we never put pressure on them to share business intelligence or something like that. So I think we have a quite effective, good working relationship. One issue where it's really important to have a good cooperation is on cryptation. I think that's really, really crucial. And that's also identified as a national security interest, and not to have a strong public-private partnership on those matters.
Thank you, Paul. Over to you, Mark.
So I would just say that the government does a pretty good job about talking about the burdens we want to put on industry. Probably what industry would like to see is a discussion of the benefits. So that benefit burden balance is the government needs to do a better job of describing. Are you going to get some kind of liability relief if you agree to a minimum level of security and information sharing? And I think that's where the next step for us. The Obama administration went pretty far in Executive Order 13636 that kind of, they had a Section 9 describe the critical function, the companies that really are critical functions of the U.S. economy, and we need to include everyone in there, including the technology companies, moving forward, probably in legislation, so that the companies know it's a persistent, perpetual U.S. commitment of benefits and burdens. And I think that will go a long way to improving the situation.
And if I may add, I think exposure breeds willingness to cooperate, and the challenge we have had across the West over the past 30 years, but hasn't been a problem really, is that there is very little understanding in civil society about national security, simply because national security hasn't been a problem, hasn't posed a problem to our daily lives, and in fact has been something we could almost forget about, and was something that the armed forces and the wider government looked after. And now with Grayzone aggression, all of that is changing, and it's becoming incumbent on all of us to do our part. And the question is then, what is my part as a citizen? What is my part as a company? Who should tell me what to do? Is it up to me? Is it up to my doing the right thing for the country? Or should there be legislation? And how should that be? Who should decide what the appropriate level of responsibility is for citizens and for companies? And so all of that is happening as we speak. Those conversations, more in some countries than in others, but it's happening everywhere. And so it will be extremely interesting, not just interesting, it will be vital to see the progress of these conversations and actions. And as I mentioned, with regards to Grayzone exercises involving industry, that's a case where one NATO government just took immediate action and is beginning to implement it. So, and the good news is that we as Western countries, liberal democracies, have lots of allies to learn from, to trade best practices with, trade ideas with. So even though we are vulnerable because we are open societies, we do have that phenomenal advantage of friends who we can not just work with, but learn from. So that leaves me with the sad news that our time is up, and I think we have had some fantastic insights here from Mark, Hélène, and Paul from different geographical areas and from different subject areas. And I think all have highlighted how relevant and really urgent the need or how relevant Grayzone aggression is and how urgent the need to address it is, because we are affected by it, all of us, whether we know it or not. So thank you very much for listening in. Thank you for your interesting and insightful questions. And we'll have many more of these events. So please keep checking back. And thank you all. Thank you to the speakers, and see you soon.